Thanks for joining us here. If you're tuning in on our YouTube channel, thanks for checking out our video. My name is Mako Nagasawa. I'm the director of the Anastasis Center. We're talking about one of the trickiest, touchiest subjects today, abortion policy. I did author a book called Abortion Policy and Christian Social Ethics. It was released in 2021, actually January 6th of 2021, which was an auspicious day. And during this a three-session course, I'm distilling down some of the major themes in the book, not all of them, but some of the major ones into kind of bite-sized chunks. And so thanks for joining us for this one. We're going to talk about the pro-economic justice argument against the Reagan coalition. And I think this will situate or help us situate why does the modern anti-abortion movement put its anti-abortion position in connection with kind of a laissez-faire capitalism and a hardcore criminal justice framework. So what's the goals of our time? Two goals. Number one is to identify mistakes that Christians have made in the past, especially the recent past, and aim to correct them on topics like contraception, economics, and so on and so forth. So that has a real impact, and I want to back up into scripture and also some church history in order to kind of understand our current moment a little better. And then secondly, discern how abortion is used for other political purposes, because there is and there has been ambiguity even in scripture itself. That ambiguity tends to get manipulated, and the consequences are devastating and even counterproductive, right? So we've been talking about how it is that people who say they're against abortion don't necessarily make other policies that would drive down the abortion rate. And so, we need to wrestle with that. Why is that? So right from the beginning, I want to say that I'm coming at this as a Christian, and I'm primarily speaking to other Christians because there have been Christian mistakes in especially the United States and connected to colonialism that actually drive the abortion rate up or keep it higher than it that really should be. And for that reason, you might wonder, okay, Mako, what do you say to the secular left? Because they approach abortion from a different angle and they have different arguments. What do you say to that? Now, I do have things to say. I've said them in the book, but for these particular videos and classes, what I'm doing is primarily speaking as a Christian to other Christians. And then if you're not a Christian, but you know Christians who fall into these mistakes, I really want you to consider sharing these videos with them, getting their feedback. You can have them come at me. That's totally fine. I'm glad to dialogue and debate with people. Just some background information about me and the Anastasis Center for Christian Education. That's the organization I founded and direct. We focus on early Christian restorative justice, deeply rooted in Scripture and in the early church. And on the topic of abortion in particular, we do have a study guide. You could go to anastasiscenter.org. It is currently a three session thing, also kind of mirroring the major topics that I'm covering here. There are video classes and messages on a whole bunch of other topics. We have a kind of a library of Bible studies, evangelism tools, and a whole bunch of other things. You could, if you're interested in joining our discussion group on Facebook, it's called Healing, Atonement, and Restorative Justice. So we talk about this and a whole bunch of other topics. We put out news about ourselves and the things our staff are doing on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And then you can engage with me on Facebook. I have an author page, the Mako A. Nagasawa. One is primarily dedicated to the abortion policy book and this topic. So the other one is the personal page, and that's for everything else. And then there's also Instagram and Twitter/X. So would love to interact with you about this and any other topic anytime. All right, so today I'm going to recap session one a little bit. We'll talk about other people's children and the modern pro-life movement, and then we'll discuss that a little bit. And then we'll talk about early versus later Christian views on wealth and poverty, and then talk about that. And then we will wrap up. Okay, so session one was about the pro-contraception argument from scripture and science. So I was making a very narrow a specific argument based on scripture, primarily Exodus 21, but also Numbers 5. If you notice, that's a very important passage of scripture. In Numbers 5, God causes some abortions. It's fascinating because there's a moral principle there of legitimate parentage. And it's too much to go into now, but look at the video last time. And in Exodus 21, which is the major text that we looked at last week, God says that the fetus does not have full personhood until either birth and breath, if you are holding to the Hebrew Masoretic, or body and build, if you're looking at the Greek Septuagint translation, which was, translated 250 years or so before Jesus. Neither translation would indicate that the fetus should be given full human personhood from conception. So that's really interesting. And the early Christians looked at science, two different scientific authorities, Hippocrates and Galen in the Greek East, Aristotle in the Latin West, in order to discern, like, well, what happens before a miscarriage happens, right? Like, because observing a miscarriage is after the fact. And so if you want to say anything about the fetus, you have to rely on science as a friend, which the early church did. And I think that's an important role model for us, because in the 1800s, Christians in the West, both Catholic and Protestant, started to look at science as a foe, not as a friend. And they used abortion in the context of their fears of science to try to do an end run morally and also epistemically. So very important context. And that led me to affirm a full range of contraceptive care for women. If you look from 1973, the increase in contraception availability has really driven down the abortion rate. It's not the only factor, but if you look at Obama's tenure and the Affordable Care Act, that pretty much is the main driver of that steep decline. This chart also suggests that during Republican presidencies, the economics of the issue of our economic lives also affects the abortion rate, including during the Trump years. So notice the uptick there. It is, and that's what we're going to get into here. Why does that tend to happen? Today, we're going to talk about other people's children and the modern pro-life movement. Well, let me start with a quote from Senator Ron Johnson, Republican from Wyoming. In January of 2022, he said this: "I've never really felt it was society's responsibility to take care of other people's children." Okay. Now, what was going on at the time? He was expressing his desire to not renew the child tax credit, which lifted half of America's children which were in poverty before, out of poverty. There was a tax credit that would have been about $3,600 per child. He opposed Biden's effort to help families find childcare options. So you remember the Inflation Reduction Act used to have childcare as part of the overall picture of, like, how do families need support here? And he wanted to slash unemployment benefits to make people get back to work. This is part of the challenge here, that the anti-abortion movement has become glommed on or wedded to an economic platform that says you're on your own with your kids. The idea that we don't have a responsibility to take care of other people's children even flies in the face of a pro-business agenda, right? Don't we have to produce an educated workforce so that people can hire good people, talented people, or give folks the chance to get ahead and kind of broaden their horizons? And don't we have a responsibility to uphold constitutional promises like a jury of our peers? How do you do that if people aren't educated, if they don't know basic things about law and civics and our relational connections, or about logic? So we do take care of other people's children. That's the reality. We have clean water, we have roads, we have schools, we have all kinds of things. So it is hard for me to hear things like this, especially from a Christian ethics standpoint and also philosophically in general. So from a Christian ethics standpoint, I think you see God saying, I definitely do care for everyone's children, and I want you to care for everyone's children too, Old Testament and New Testament. Primary Old Testament example, Leviticus 25, the Jubilee year, where God says, I'm going to re-gift the garden land to you because you're all my kids. And it's as if you're coming into the garden land for the first time, because in the 49 or 50 years in between the Jubilee years, all kinds of crazy things can happen. People get displaced, go into poverty, there's famines, like irresponsibility. God says, I'm going to press a land family reset button, and I'm going to limit the type of advantage and disadvantage that can be passed on intergenerationally. It's as if I'm bringing you to the garden land for the first time. Ezekiel 16 is also a statement of a new covenant principle, but I think it's a very important one where God says, I don't want children to have to suffer for the sins of their parents. And then when Jesus comes along, he welcomes children and says, I want you to care about all these children. I want you to be like these children. And in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you know what follows that little episode? It's the rich young ruler story where Jesus says, I want you to give all your, wealth to the poor and follow me. And the disciples are like, that sounds really hard, but we've done that. And Jesus says, great. Yeah, you are the norm and the standard for what it means to be Jewish. It's ultimately to follow me and to share in farms, families, fields, houses, right? Like I'm bringing people back into a community that humanity should have been like from creation if the fall had not happened. And in Matthew 19:28, he calls that the regenesising of everything. I'm regenesising humanity. And so the generosity and sharing and hospitality that humanity should have had, I'm bringing that back. So from a Christian ethics standpoint, it's pretty clear to me, yeah, we're supposed to care for other people's kids. And philosophically, it challenges the United States idea that we're a meritocracy. Because what have children done to deserve all the advantages and disadvantages that they can possibly inherit? Nothing. They haven't done anything. Now, we tend to say, well, parents have the right to pass down all of the advantages and disadvantages that they could possibly give. But when you look at children and you center the children, then it becomes absurd. I mean, we got to remember children do not choose their parents. So, how is it fair for children to inherit everything that their parents give them, advantages or disadvantages? It's not fair. Why do we allow that? I think it's important to point out what is the cost of having children? Because if we're not going to care about other people's children, what are other families left to? Well, we know some of the stats about how expensive it is to bring children into the world. If you don't have health insurance, then I think the average cost of giving birth in a hospital is about $15,000. It varies according to, which state you're in. In California, it could be over $26,000. That's insane. Baby formula cost $2,900 in May of 2022. That's a pretty substantial jump. I mean, that's after the baby formula crisis. Child care is really expensive, between $4,000 to $10,000 a year. And abortion pills, by contrast, cost less than $400. Abortion surgery costs between $400 to $2,000. That raises really important questions about, okay, so who's getting these abortions? Now, the New York Times had an article that looked at the best abortion data that we have and said the typical abortion patient is already a mother, is in her late 20s, attended some college, has a low income, is unmarried, is in her first 6 weeks of pregnancy, is having her first abortion, and lives in a blue state. I thought that was really helpful to know because I think there's a stereotype of, the typical woman who procures an abortion is, I don't know, 18 or 19, a college student, using it as a form of birth control because it's just available. And I'm sure that happens, but this complicates the picture. It is someone who actually is getting an abortion because she is trying to care for the children she has. So it is not someone who wants to avoid motherhood. It's especially important for poor women because women in poverty have an abortion rate of 3 times the rate of women not in poverty. And they procured 42.4% of all abortions. And I think that compares to, like people in poverty in the US comprise what, 15 to 18% of the US population? And women must be half of that. So between 7.5 to 9% of the US population.
Or women are probably more likely to feel like living with a boyfriend is a good way to escape a bad situation, or to feel safe in her community, or just to get ahead because it costs more to be a woman. Just think about how much more a woman has to spend on professional clothes and her appearance and healthcare than men do.
But it's not just poor women. Married women in Europe, Africa, Asia, and South America get the majority of abortions. That's very interesting. We could talk about a little bit of why, but in the US, they get between 14 to 15% of all abortions. That would not include women who hoped perhaps to marry the man they conceived a child with, but for different reasons decided, I don't think this is a good idea. That is a different slice of the data. So again, women who are already mothers procure 60% of abortions, and half of them have 2 or more children already. So if you ask any parent, is parenting easy or hard? I think we would answer it is hard, and that is part of the reason for getting an abortion. So the economics of it are important to look at, because when we look at women and men in despair, here are 2 data points. As of the Great Recession in 2008 and 2009, Google searches of self-induced abortions jumped. And then when we look at Rust Belt communities, there was an excellent study done. And these are very hard calculations to make for different reasons. But I think it's pretty sure that as manufacturing jobs went overseas, men were less likely to marry. It has to do with confidence. It has to do with hope for the future. I think we need to care about that, because do you think as manufacturing jobs went overseas that people were having less sex? I'd really doubt it, right? But people are getting married at lower rates. So why is that? As we start to look more into that, we have to acknowledge that being a Christian increases the likelihood that we're going to blame the victim of poverty. And this was an article that summarized a study that was taken of a survey taken of about 1,800 people. And they connected people's attitudes towards people in poverty and the explanation of it, like what's to blame, and connected it to their religious affiliation and race and a bunch of other things. But essentially, if you're atheist or agnostic or have no affiliation, you're 31% likely to say that a person in poverty is there because of their own lack of effort, and 65% were likely to say because of difficult circumstances outside of their control. Notice how this changes. Now, Black Christians basically said the same. 32% said lack of effort, 64% difficult circumstances. All Christians said, or broadly said, 46% said lack of effort. Catholics, 50% said lack of effort. And if you're a white evangelical, 53% of white evangelicals blamed lack of effort, blamed a poor person for just not giving enough effort. Why is it that this happens, right? Is there something about Western Christianity that somehow increases? Is it our insight? Do we somehow have better vision? Do we have X-ray vision into people's hearts? Or is there something about our theology and spiritual formation that make us almost twice as likely to blame the poor, right, for being poor on lack of effort? Why is that? So that really factors in to, before we answer that question, that really factors into this observation that there was an earlier pro-life movement anchored by US Catholics at around the time of the Great Depression. They were New Deal Democrats. The other one is the one that we contend with, which is the one led by white evangelicals that are connected to the Republican Party. But there was an earlier pro-life movement that was very different. Catholics were immigrant communities. They lived during the Great Depression and saw the abortion rate skyrocket. Why? Well, it's understandable. If you don't have hope for your life, why would you want to bring a child into it? So they looked at FDR, who was appealed by Christian faith to folks and said things like, we're going to use the federal government to give a boost to people to protect them from the worst things that can happen and to try to create a society where people can get ahead. And so they had big infrastructure projects. They developed the welfare state, namely unemployment, disability, and Social Security. They did promote housing via home loans for some, for white folks, especially after World War II with the GI Bill. But that was one effort to try to put people into stable homes and build out basically the white suburbs. Now, I have very mixed feelings about that whole thing. Here, in this context, there was an effort to develop an ownership society, right, and help people be in neighborhoods. It was even tied to schooling, again, primarily for white children, but there was a lot of thought given to how housing is connected to schooling, because of course kids grow up in houses and neighborhoods and zip codes and neighborhood schools of some sort, right? And then there were a bunch of pro-labor regulations on corporations and trade. They wanted to protect consumers against indebtedness. They wanted to protect the economy against banking risks because, Wall Street firms caused the Great Crash. They wanted to protect workers against slave labor competition. So I think it's the Smoot-Hawley Act of 1929 that said we're going to protect American producers from slave-produced goods. We want honorable labor, right? Like fairly paid labor. We don't always enforce that law today, but it's there on the books. And the vision was a democracy of small businesses that were antitrust and anti-monopoly. In other words, they thought that being anti-poverty and kind of stabilizing people's lives would also bring down the abortion rate. They connected being pro-life to being anti-poverty. That's very different than the 80s. So the modern anti-abortion movement, and I'm not calling them pro-life for a reason. I call them anti-abortion because I don't think they deserve the title pro-life. Ronald Reagan stitched together a political coalition of three major groups of people. They were the anti-communist hawks on foreign policy, the neoconservatives that wanted to militarize and beat the USSR, also imperialists eager for resources in Latin America, and then the Pentagon people who wanted to fuel the military industrial complex and make a fortune doing it. That was one group of people. Then there were the anti-communists, and I put that in quotes because I don't think it's accurate to say this, but that is how they sold it. The anti-communists on domestic policy. They wanted to dismantle the New Deal, right? So everything that FDR put together and that the Catholic Democrats, New Deal Democrats put together, the Reagan and white evangelical coalition wanted to dismantle it. They were the libertarians. They were the states' rights white segregationists, and they were the anti-labor, pro-business, pro-corporate people. And then there was the anti-communist pro-family morality. And again, I put both of those labels in quotes. Ever since the 1930s, there were Christians who organized against the New Deal. It was called the Christian Libertarian Movement. I could talk about that more if you want. And then during the 50s and 60s, white evangelicals called Dr. King and other Black civil rights leaders communist. Were they communist? No, it was just a fear tactic, a way to connect Joseph McCarthy's like anti-communist scare to the civil rights movement, as if they're fifth colonists that are going to destroy us from within. And in the 1980s, abortion then got connected to that because there were people who said, who gets abortions? It's the atheists. And who organizes the atheists? It's the communists. I'm being serious. I mean, even though what 60 to 70% of all women who procured abortions during this time were Catholic and Protestant, they said, well, abortion happens because people are rejecting God and they're not trusting God. So at least functionally, they're atheists. So here's a quote of that. Richard Vigueri, who's co-founder the Moral Majority in 1979 and 1980, along with Paul Weyrich, we'll look at him in just a minute, and Jerry Falwell. Senior. They had advised Richard Nixon, and then they came alongside Reagan and formed the moral majority. And this is how Richard Vigueri did fundraising. He says this, quote, "The abortion issue is the door through which many people come into conservative politics, but they don't stop there. Their convictions against abortion are like the first in a series of falling dominoes. Then we lead them to concern about sexual ethics and standards among young people." Like, sure, get really judgmental about your kids, right? This leads to opposition to secular humanism. Then, particularly in the schools, with a purportedly decent morality, we point out that secular humanism is identified as both the godfather and the royal road to socialism and communism, which points the way to minimally regulated free enterprise at home and to aggressive foreign and military policy to counter the communist threat of Russia and its many surrogates. This is no joke. Actually, Vigueri and Weyrich, they were Catholics, but they were not good Catholics. And they recognized we could peel off people from the South, the white segregationists and white evangelicals from the South and the West, to join the Republicans, to leave the Democratic Party and to join the Republicans. And so they positioned abortion not in the context of, well, Scripture has ambiguities. Neither the Hebrew Masoretic nor the Greek Septuagint say that personhood should begin from conception. And in the West, we inherit the view of quickening, right? So early abortion was okay, late abortion was not. So what was the reason for abortion? It was Scripture. It was not secular humanism. I mean, at least in some cases. And they were reluctant to acknowledge quickening as a Christian understanding that was around in 1787. Quickening, which happened halfway through the pregnancy, that was the point from which people at the time said, yeah, we don't want to do abortions after that. That's when mom feels the baby kick. But before then, we think it's understandable, like it's acceptable and legal. And that was rooted in the Greek Septuagint text of Exodus 21 and Aristotle, which was actually more morally discerning or stricter than the Hebrew Masoretic. So now the anti-abortion position becomes connected to not a pro-democracy, anti-poverty, and democracy of small business kind of build out the middle class idea. It becomes connected to neoliberal capitalism. We want to dismantle those social supports. We want to dismantle the regulation. And Vigueri identifies also less regulated capitalism with true Christianity. So that begins. Even though Christian faith has historically been more pro-labor, pro-ecology, pro-investing in the population through economic support, literacy, schooling, and healthcare, and so on. You look at the history of Christianity in Europe, and many kings started schools because they wanted their people to be literate. The Eastern Byzantine Empire, the Roman Empire in the East, started a massive healthcare hospital network that was very effective. Scientific knowledge was funded and perpetuated through the government, right? But like all of this stuff gets like thrown out. This is why I love church history, because it disproves this claim. So the other reason, though, why Vigueri's fundraising pitch was effective is it countered the civil rights movement. For a long time, for years, the Republican Party and conservatives were looking for an argument against the civil rights movement. And so when someone said, look at, what about the rights of oppressed minorities? They wanted an even more helpless demographic. And so they were able to say, well, what about the rights of the babies? And it was successful. It appeals to our sense of heroism, our sense of they're defenseless, voiceless. So who else is going to stand up for them? It also fit into kind of a you get what you deserve idea that Republicans and especially Reagan were promoting. And so, with his whole, like, you shouldn't depend on the government, government's the problem, there's welfare queens taking advantage of the system. What he promoted was an individualistic way to appropriate meritocratic retributive justice. The idea that if you do good things, you should be rewarded. If you do bad things, you should go to jail. As it applies to sexual ethics and abortion, the idea is if you get married and have kids, you should have a good life, or you will have a good life. If you have if you have sex before you're ready and if you have kids before marriage, then you should have a hard life. Like that is what you deserve. We don't want to help you. And if you perform an abortion, you should be punished. So you could see now abortion policy became an extension of capitalism and criminality. When Trump was running in 2016 and he was asked, should women be punished if they get an abortion? And he said yes. And people were like, he just said the quiet part out loud. But then a lot of people in the anti-abortion camp was like, no, he didn't mean that. We just want to strip doctors of their licenses or something like that. But now, I mean, that has opened the floodgates. There are pastors out there saying that abortion is homicide or murder and women should be punished for getting an abortion. It's out there. And it shares the belief of most white evangelicals that God's justice is retributive and not restorative, which I will get into in the next session, in session 3. Paul Weyrich says, gives us a little more context that he connects with issues of race and retributive justice. He says this: what galvanized the Christian community was not abortion, school prayer, or the ERA. And he's talking about the early 70s because he was trying to, again, bring more white evangelicals, Southern Democrats into the Republican Party. He says, I am living witness to that because I was trying to get those people interested in those issues, and I utterly failed. What changed their mind was Jimmy Carter's intervention against the Christian schools. He's talking about the white segregation academies in the South, trying to deny their tax-exempt status on the basis of the so-called de facto segregation. So when Jimmy Carter said, look, if you're going to be racist like that, I'm not going to make that tax exempt. This is really important because I think a lot of white evangelicals tell themselves the story that, yeah, we weren't that involved in politics until 1973, Roe v. Wade was passed down. And then we jumped into politics because we wanted to protect those babies. But they were actually involved in politics. They were involved in trying to overturn Brown v. Board, right? So what was the rhetoric there? Those unelected judges, the federal government meddling in our business, and we have freedom of religion. Those things that rhetoric just transferred over into the anti-abortion camp. So this is contrary to the culture war narrative that evangelicals were like drawn back into national politics to defend the unborn. No, they were already involved. If you want more resources on that, Carolyn Renee DuPont writes a book, Mississippi Praying, Southern White Evangelicals and the Civil Rights Movement, where the legal architecture and rhetoric was set by their opposition to Brown v. Board. Heather McGee talks about also, she makes a parable of that's relevant to the concept of, like the other people's children, I shouldn't have to care about them. She makes a parable of, she observes what happens when in the South, public swimming pools were integrated, that a whole bunch of communities disinvested from them. So these swimming pools became empty, they became overgrown with weeds, or they became concreted over and, they became something else. People built private swimming pools in their own backyards so that their own kids could enjoy them, but other people's kids, they couldn't enjoy them because they did not want Black children benefiting from public swimming pools. The idea is the observation is public investment in shared projects and spaces and efforts just dries up, right? And that also fits into the modern anti-abortion position. In the 22 states that restricted abortion after Dobbs in 2022, they practiced a lot of you're on your own economics or yo-yo economics. You also see higher maternal death rates in those states. You see higher infant mortality rates. Many refuse the ACA Medicaid expansion. And then they have low literacy rates, low rates of COVID safety. And so you really have to ask the question especially if you're, for example, a Black woman or a poor woman who faces high maternal death rates, abortion is actually safer than carrying a baby to term. What do we say about that? What do we do with that? Another book, Heather Cox Richardson, How the South Won the Civil War, talks about how the Southern strategy actually worked. after 1964. So the Democratic Party stands for civil rights. That causes a defection of white segregationists from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. Southern Baptist pastors and Western politicians were actually really instrumental in that. So Goldwater, Nixon, and Reagan, they were actually Western politicians. And if you want to read a really good article, also Chris Ladd in Forbes says, pastors, not politicians, turned Dixie Republican. Very informative. Mary Ziegler studies the anti-abortion movement and says this contributed to the anti-democracy movement. Paul Weyrich is on record in a YouTube speech to conservatives in 1980 saying, I don't want everybody to vote. Elections are not won by a majority of people. They never have been from the beginning of our country, and they are not now. As a matter of fact, our leverage in the elections, quite candidly, goes up as the voting populace goes down. So there's a deep connection to the basically fascist, anti-democratic efforts of Trump or even the Supreme Court to roll back the Voting Rights Act. And it has to do with the anti-abortion campaign. One of the primary movers behind Citizens United in 2010, corporate donors, unlimited corporate funds anonymously. The anti-abortion movement was behind that. All right, so I would like for us to discuss this. You might have some pushback or other questions, but at minimum, I would like to talk about three questions. Number one, hypothetically, if people are going to have sex no matter what, and all government policies can do is shape the conditions in which they get married or not, what policies would you make? I ask that question because I think the data actually does lean in that direction. I wouldn't put it so bleakly as that. I think that's framing people's behavior, especially their sexual behavior, in a different light, right? I think sometimes I think conservatives believe that a hard economic policy and really a tough anti-abortion policy will persuade people to not have sex until they're married and then only have the number of kids that they can afford, right? I mean, I think that's actually mistaken. This question flips the whole framing around. Number two, hypothetically, if you could reduce the abortion rate to zero by financially assisting women to give birth and then providing a stipend to adoptive families for free housing, childcare, healthcare, and college tuition by raising taxes on the rich, would you do it? Why or why not? And number three, do you think you're on your own in parenting should be society's retribution for people having sex when they shouldn't? Let me pause the recording here. We'll discuss and then we'll come back. All right. So I want to just glance at early versus later Christian views on wealth and poverty and understand, yes, it once again is because of defective Christian teaching, mostly related to colonialism, that landed us or that fuels the movement in this direction, and that it's mostly Protestant and not Catholic. All right. So this is Basil of Caesarea, who says that poverty is really important as a factor to consider when looking at things like infanticide and abortion. Here, he's talking about infanticide and he's talking about church discipline. He's not talking about like what kind of laws the Roman state should have, but he is talking about church discipline, which is mainly withholding communion. Okay, that's important to keep in mind. If a woman abandons her newborn child uncared for on the road, if, although she was really able to save it, she disregarded it, either thinking in this way to conceal her sin or scheming in some entirely brutal and inhuman manner, let her be judged as for murder. But if she was unable to protect it, and the child perished through destitution and the want of necessities of life, the mother is to be pardoned. I think that's really significant. What's going on here? Basil of Caesarea was a doctor. He was a bishop. He was one of the leading theologians of the 4th century. And he is acknowledging that it's not just like a person's choices. It's also the social context. Now, I'm quoting this because I think he would say something similar about abortion, or if not the same. The early Christians pushed back on kind of the Greco-Roman culture of having throwaway babies, right? And so they were actually quite critical of abortion and infanticide practices, again, which were very common. So that's why I think it's justifiable to look at this quote and to say this is one of the leading thinkers and pastoral theologians and leaders. Like he's not just a teacher somewhere. He's actually a bishop, and he's one of the leaders of the councils too. And that's the other significant thing about the fourth century is that bishops were able to meet in councils much more often and kind of standardize their approaches pastorally to different things. So they were very practical. They weren't always just debating intellectual issues. They were practical. And it's a matter of kind of organizational standardization. Like, what are our best practices here? And that was because Christian faith was becoming less persecuted and more accepted, but it was not yet dominant. And so this is an important moment. So I think this teaches us quite a bit. What happened then? I made the comment, colonialism deformed what Christians believed about wealth being shared. There were some major scriptures that the early Christians tended to focus on. Genesis 1 was a big deal. God gave land and the creation and all its resources to humanity as a gift in common. God gave land to peoples with boundaries. So there was passages like Genesis 10 and others. The earth is the Lord's is a phrase from Psalm 24. Paul quotes it in 1 Corinthians 10. And the fruit of the earth belongs to all. That idea is best illustrated by the law of gleaning in Deuteronomy 24, where even if you quote unquote own the land as an ancient Israelite, you can only harvest the first crop. The second crop, because crops bear fruit at multiple times in a season, the second crop is for the poor, the lame, the widow, the orphan, right? Like, even though you say you own the land, God really owns the land, and he intends for these things to be given to or be available to those who need it. So these are really important passages to the early church. Here's an example. Ambrose of Milan. Milan was the Washington, D.C. plus Wall Street of the Western Roman Empire, right, rolled together because the emperors lived there. He says this, it is not anything of yours that you're bestowing on the poor. Rather, you're giving back something of his. For you alone are usurping what was given in common for the use of all. The earth belongs to everyone, not to the rich, but there are fewer who do not use what is theirs than who do use it. You are giving back something that is owed then, and not bestowing something that is not owed. In other words, this is about justice, not charity. It's about anti-hoarding, as opposed to, look how productive I am, and now I get to call myself a good person and launder my greed and exploitation by giving something to charity. Let me also point out Gregory of Nyssa, about the same time, uses Genesis 1 as his abolitionist text and says it's because you're interfering with the natural law God established. For you subject to the yoke of slavery one who was created precisely to be a master of the earth and who was ordained to rule by the Creator. How much money did you pay as a fair price for the image of God? For how much money have you sold the nature specially formed by God? God said, let us make man in our image and likeness. Notice how he's saying Genesis 1, the creation before the fall, that's still live as a moral vision. We don't start with Genesis 3 in the fall and just talk about human guilt and then just jump right to Jesus. No, actually, Genesis 1 is still an ethical vision, and his anti-slavery reasoning comes out of you're interfering with someone's ability to work the creation in the proper way, to enjoy it, to do it freely. And it just shows like how much humanity was meant to share the creation in common. John Chrysostom, Archbishop of Constantinople, are not the earth and the fullness thereof the Lord's? If therefore our possessions are the common gift of the Lord, they belong also to our fellows. For all the things of the Lord are common. And then Thomas Aquinas, the most celebrated medieval Catholic thinker, in cases of need, all things are common property. There is no sin in taking private property when need has made it common. Now, that had a huge influence on early English law. The Christian Anglo-Saxons were conquered by the Normans in 1066, and then the Anglo-Saxons pushed back. This is important because English law shapes the way we think of US law or what actually happened in American law. I would say the high point of Christian influence on English law is 1102, 1215, and 1217. And it has to do with property and political protection. So in 1102, the London Church Council says everyone should emancipate all their remaining slaves. 10% of the population goes free. So people cannot be property. The English Magna Carta was 1215. That's political liberty and the ability to impeach everyone except the king for not doing their job. The opposite, we are, and the American Revolution took that and said, let's make all public officers all a matter of public trust, right? All government officials, we can impeach anyone, except we're not doing that. We're in danger of losing that, one of the most Christian ideas ever. In 1217, there was the English Charter of the Forest, which was your economic Bill of Rights. The forest was not just wooded lands, it was also meadows, it was rivers, it was marshes. It was just lands that were protected by the crown and administered together by the peasants. And so Boston Common, for instance, or other commons are a legacy of that. And so if you needed to chop down wood because you needed fuel for your fire, you could go do that in the commons. And the peasants worked out a way to not deplete the commons. So that's really important to say because we have a myth called the tragedy of the commons. Everyone just, abuses common things. No, people can work things out. The charter of the forest was a guarantee that you could have energy, you could feed your animals, you could go fish, you could get water. This was all eroded by the enclosure movement when the aristocrats built fences, kept the peasants out, and manipulated parliament to protect that. And it drove the peasantry into urban poverty and made them cheap labor for factories, or they were named as criminals. And so the prison state proliferated, and then the colonies were kind of an outlet, right? It was an outlet valve for the peasants to go somewhere else. So this is where the US gets a lot of people, and Australia got a lot of people. But this is the context in which we need to understand this man, John Locke. John Locke was a huge influence on American political thought and religious thought. So we tend to think of him as a political philosopher. He did not think of himself that way. He thought of himself as a theologian and a Christian ethicist because that's how he wrote. So he lived in the 1600s. He was the architect of the original Constitution of the Carolinas. He thought that the Constitution should never change. Oh my gosh, right. He was a major influence on Thomas Jefferson, the Constitution, and American legal thought. His main contribution was private property. It was an absolute right. People can claim private property before they enter into community, which is amazing to say. And I would just as a person of Japanese descent for whom family is like, like first you're born into families and then you could divide stuff. Like his theory is just incredible to me. But this is the libertarian dream. If private property is an absolute, then you can only have a minimal government that enforces contract. And so we get things like Ben Shapiro appearing on PragerU saying, if we lose John Locke, we lose America. Now, there are things about John Locke that I also appreciate. I wish we had time to get into that, but just to say, this is a libertarian dream. More serious work has been done in Law and Liberty by David Lewis Schaefer. Here's an article here called Locke's American Legacy. He gave one of the justifications for colonization. I won't go into it here. He was a biblical scholar. He wrote explicitly Christian arguments. So 2 treatises of government was a Christian argument. It was about biblical interpretation. And this is where he gets his understanding of private property. Here's a few examples. God gave the world to men in common, but see, he knows what Christians before him have said, but it cannot be supposed he meant it should always remain common and uncultivated. See, he's making a false connection there. He gave it to the use of the industrious and rational, and labor was to be his title to it. So if you work harder than the last guy, in principle, you have a type of justification to take away his land, especially if you're an English colonist dealing with Native Americans. His theory is if you remove whatsoever, then he removes out of the state that nature hath provided and left it in. He hath mixed his labor with it and joined to it something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property. So if you just, if you go to Boston Common, Jeremy, you could make a little farm and then claim it as your own. And he just totally disses Native Americans by calling them poor in all the comforts of life. A king of a large and fruitful territory there feeds, lodges, and is clad worse than a day laborer in England. I don't know that that was true, but in any case, like other observers of Native Americans were amazed at their civilization, how they learned to farm in rocky soil, how they learned to tame trees. They were like, you could race a horse at full speed through a forest because of the way they've organized the forests and the trees. Amazing appreciation. Roger Williams was one of those people. John Locke was not. So Barbara Arneal basically says, these are my words. John Locke asserted Genesis 1 meant you could take other people's land if you were more productive than them. Locke intentionally misrepresented Native Americans, becoming one of the earliest white people to accuse non-white people of laziness. Now, this contributes to why Americans tend to fear smarter immigrants or people of color, why the Charlottesville marchers said Jews will not replace us. Like, replace you? Why are you talking about being replaced? Who wants to replace you? Join you, but see, that's the whole thing, right? Like the fear is we'll be replaced. This is why we have a culture of workaholism, why we believe productivity justifies the destruction of land. So talk about having an anti-child agenda, right? If you're going to destroy the planet, then why are you going to be pro-life or anti-abortion? And believe that America is a pure meritocracy when it isn't. So this is a major contributor to Reagan's coalition. Thankfully, John Locke is not the only voice in American law. So Benjamin Franklin said to Thomas Jefferson, private property is the creation of society. Like we shouldn't use Locke's life, liberty, and property phrase, even though Thomas Jefferson wanted to. And so they switched. It's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then the Fifth Amendment has eminent domain as a possibility. It's called the takings clause. I'm aware it could be abused, but in principle, right, like this is really important if we're going to solve ecological issues or force BlackRock to sell back homes because big institutional investors really drive up the price of homes. So if we think that economics is related to why people get abortions, then we're going to have to care about things like this. Unfortunately, white evangelicals totally take the side of John Locke. Wayne Grudem is an example. The Bible clearly takes the side of individual ownership of property. My conclusion is that the estate tax should be permanently repealed. Like, it's amazing how he concludes that from Leviticus 25, the Jubilee law. And you can see my critique of him. Anyway, would love to discuss this. Here are some discussion questions for us. John Locke's theory is a bad theology of private property. I'm underscoring the word theology. It is a Christian heresy that contributes to poverty and therefore the abortion rate. What do we do about that? How much ownership should we take in that as Christians? Do we argue, with others about it? Number two, do you think allowing people to fall into poverty is compatible with seeking to bring down the abortion rate? Why or why not? And number three, is family values really code for every family for itself? All right, I'm going to hit pause here. Well, we're back. I want to reiterate that I want to be tradition specific. I'm coming at this as a Christian, and I want to speak primarily to other Christians. Of course, if you are not a Christian, but you know Christians and you want to be able to dialogue and debate with them or understand them, I think this is still really helpful. And I think doing tradition-specific work is really important. Because I think there are so many things about the Christian tradition in America, what we've inherited in the US, that actually is counterproductive. Bad theology about wealth and poverty coming from John Locke and other people actually drives the abortion rate up. So for the Reagan coalition to stitch together the anti-abortion movement with a pro-capitalism, pro-criminality framework is actually driving the abortion rate up, whereas we could push it down further with contraception and a pro-woman policy that we'll get into next time.